Let me walk you through how I go about doing research for metal detecting, typically before I go out, but sometimes afterwards. And specifically, I'll show you how I go about overlaying various maps and images with one another. So let me begin by some of the common tools that I use. You should have similar tools depending on where you live, but you'll obviously have to search for them. I use Google Maps quite a bit to find places near me, but I'm also using it to get down to Street View. I use this feature quite a bit, especially if it's an area I'm not familiar with, where I might want to fly by and see where I could potentially park, or I'll often use this to find locations to get into streams, so I can kind of drive around. Especially if it's a location far away from my house, I can check out before I get there to see if there's somewhere that I could park or pull off or access a stream. So I do use Google quite a bit. In addition, in my area, we have, and I live in Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, we have maps that go back to the 1870s and 1850s that are pretty widely available. These are put out by the Beers and Company, so these are typically called Beers maps. I believe most counties around me in Pennsylvania have similar maps and similar date ranges. I'm not sure about other states, but I would imagine many of the East Coast states have similar maps. So you should definitely get familiar with what maps you have available and how far back they go. I rely very heavily on these 1872 maps. One place in particular that I was researching when I get down here to South Middleton, and you can kind of see my thought process here. So I'll often scan these maps, just peruse them for older houses and schools and just different places of interest. So if I zoom in on this map and scroll down a little bit, here's something that caught my attention at one point. Is a location I drive by occasionally, and there's a lot of roads around here that have school in the name of the road, like Schoolhouse Road. And, so I was curious to see what kind of schools were in this area at the time that may have attributed to the naming of the streets. And sure enough, there's something marked on this map from 1872 entitled School Number 14. And so that certainly caught my attention. So then I would be interested to go back in time from the 1870 maps here to 1858. And let me drill down in here. So we have Cumberland County here. So here we are in the same area here. I can zoom in. And in this time frame, then, the schoolhouse isn't listed on here at all. So we can assume that the schoolhouse then came between the 1850s and the 1870s at some point. So kind of a small time frame in there. But so obviously that schoolhouse caught my interest. Now, some other tools that I use. So Pennsylvania has this nice imagery navigation that I do use this tool as well. And if we zoom in, so let me go, I'm a little bit west of Harrisburg here. And we have Boiling Springs. Yeah, I went a little too far. All right, so right here is that area of interest. What this tool lets us do, and some of the other features that I like to use when I'm researching, is to go back and look at old aerial photos. So in Pennsylvania, they have photos that go back to the late 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. So this little tool here, you can see if you have similar tools in your area or the state that you live in. But this lets me go in and see what areas here are covered with the imagery. So these are just literally satellite, or not satellite, but aerial photos they would have flown over and gotten pictures. So I can go ahead and download once I have the right one selected. So this is a tool that I use quite often as well, and I'll go back and look at these aerial photos once I have them fully lined up with the current satellite photos. And sometimes you see houses that were there in the 1930s that weren't there on the maps, and vice versa. So these can be a lot of help. I also, from time to time, will find things like baseball fields in these old photos that don't exist today. So you can assume kids would have been playing in those areas, so maybe losing some stuff. So another feature that you can use or look for, and you may not have this tool all in one place, but this particular tool has both the old aerial photos as well as lidar all in one place. And so here what we can actually do with this tool is click in, and you can then view right on the map. So it's going to line up the lidar, and lidar is giving you a sense of different anomalies and man-made structures that are in the ground. So you could see little square rectangle things usually are represented by foundations or houses that either are there now or were there at one point. So it can kind of make out the stone foundations in the grounds. And some of the man-made lakes are probably a little bit more prevalent on here as well. And some of these might be natural, but you're really looking for things that are not natural and very square or straight edged or circular. And if we go back to, there's other versions of these. Let me see what we have here. I think that's that same view. Some of them just give you more detail. I think this one here has a little bit more detail in it. And so once again, you kind of have to scan around until you find the right road structures that will take you to the place. And I just know from having looked at this quite a few times that this little structure here is what I'm really interested in. Now, let me show you one more tool that I make use of, and this is Sketchpad. You could use any kind of image editing tool that you either have or familiar with. This one's free. I get no money from endorsing it, but I do use it because it is free. There's an enhanced version that you can pay extra for, but the tools that I need to do these map overlays are all part of the free version. So I use that to do my work. So let me go back to the original Google image here. And again, I know from working with this area of the map pretty much that this is the area of interest. And on a Windows machine, so you can either try to download images of this, but I find it much easier just to take a screen capture. And on a Windows machine, if you hit the Windows button, Shift and S, it's going to open up this snipping tool. And here you could take a capture of the whole screen or select an area with freeform. I'm just going to go and select with a rectangle. So I want to get enough that I have detail of roadways, but not too much, because these maps, they just don't line up nicely with images, with older images, with older maps. So there, once I just selected the area, you can see here it copied in my clipboard, and I can literally come over and use the Control V key. And click in there and hit Control V, and it will paste the image from the clipboard. So you now have this sitting in there. Some basic tools within here that most editing tools are going to have. I can grab this and move it around. I can scale it. And I recommend that you avoid scaling it this way or this way too much. I can kind of stretch it in one direction or another. You can undo things over here with this tool. So it's kind of nice. We can get back to the original that we were working with. But you want to try to keep the proportions the same. So I will, if I need to scale it, I usually scale out here. You can also rotate it. And then in this tool then, another feature that we'll be using in a second here is this opacity. So if you're using a different tool, I'd highly recommend you find out how or if that particular tool allows you to change opacity and change scaling. Those are really the only tools that I use within here. And so let me go and grab the image over here. This is the 1870 map that has that school site on here. And this is roughly the area that I'm working in. So again, I'm going to use that snipping tool. So I use Window key Shift S. And again, I can then grab the area. So I'm going to try to get roughly the same area that I got on the Google map. And I can come back in here, click on the view there and do Control V. And we now have this sitting over top of that one. So we actually have two images sitting in here, and you work each of them separately. They're being managed in what are called layers. Most editing tools have this concept of layers here, where you have different layers that you're working with. So I want to point out, if you are using a Mac, you can do the exact same step. You can use this exact same sketch pad. The only difference is on a Mac, to do the screen capture, you'll want to do it's Command Control Shift 4. You might want to look that up, but that's how you grab a snip of or a section of the screen to copy into your clipboard. But very similar concepts. And then the magic here is then getting this to line up. So I know that this road here is that road right there, and then this road here is this road here. Now I will say these maps do not ever line up perfectly right. So you're going to have to guess or stretch things out to make it work. So right away I know I'm going to need to tilt this so that this road kind of goes on this angle. So I can use this little feature here, rotate it around so I have like a rough idea of it. Dragging. That's pretty close to how that road's lining up there. So that works out. And now's where we can use the opacity. So if we go in here, we can change the opacity. We could see partly through the top image. So I try to get it set to a place where I can still make out the roads underneath. So we have this bright yellow line, thankfully, of this Baltimore Pike here. That will help us get it lined up. And now I want to try to get this road lined up. So it's this little section here is what needs to be lined up, and then this curve here needs to line up with this curve. So we just start stretching it until we get things to line up, and you can see how far we have to really stretch this. So I got a much bigger area of this top map than I probably should have, because it makes it a little harder to get. But there we can start to see it getting close to where it needs to be. I have a really hard time getting these to line up just perfectly. Another thing you can do is go back to the bottom layer here, and you can stretch that a little bit to make it a little bit easier. And let me go back to the top layer. Nope, I didn't want to hide it. And we can now start to hopefully get it a little bit closer. Actually, I should have gone the other way. I should have shrunk the other one. But here, we can see it starting to get close to getting lined up. Let me go the other way with this one here. Now we can scale this one in far. And we can see this road starting to get close, but now this road is off. And again, it's nearly impossible to get these lined up just perfectly. And the other thing I want to point out is you really want to get it to a point where when you're out there, things make sense metal detecting. So I'm trying to find this school site. And, it's definitely going to line somewhere on this property here. Now, I've also used a property mapper to identify who the owner of this particular property is. And we actually do have permission to go there. So I am interested to find out, where this school is. And as long as I know it's in this field, we can use some techniques when we're out there looking for iron signals. And once we get a concentration of iron signals, we'll know we're really close to the area. Let me go and grab this image here. So this again is the lidar image where we have this little anomaly here. And if I grab a screenshot of this, and I'm going to go and I'm actually going to get rid of this for a second, and we will paste that last screenshot, and this already has that opacity set. So now what we can do is try to get these roads to line up here. And this LiDAR is much more recent than that 1800s map, obviously, so the roads are going to line up much more precisely. And here we could see almost a perfect match of these, so we can play around with the opacity if we want to get a better sense. But what's really interesting is when you start to do this little anomaly that's right there, that is right where this tree cluster is. So this is suggesting to me, we won't know until we really get out there and check this, but this is suggesting to me that this tree cluster in the middle of this field has some kind of stone structure around it, and it's a fairly interesting shape. So this could be a dump of stone that the farmers did, but they would probably be piled up more and we'd see more of a irregular shape. But we have this, let me zoom here. We have this shape that to me suggests a foundation. So I have to believe that this is probably the schoolhouse because it matches up really close to where it would have been. And so we now have, a modern day LiDAR image overlaid with a current map. And we also have the old 1870s map that shows this schoolhouse was in that area. So when we go out detecting there, we're definitely going to concentrate. We're going to see if we can get into the tree cluster there. Depending how thick that tree is, we'll be able to certainly detect around there. And certainly if there was a school that was knocked down, stuff would have been spread, so it wouldn't have been right where the school was, although that's where we'd probably find the concentration of things. But this is how I go about doing research. And again, some of the tools I'm using are the current maps. I'm using LiDAR. I'm using as old a map as I can find for my area, and certainly want to use from different time frames, and also use the aerial photos that in my case goes back to the late 1930s, and then you can get aerial photos from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. And it's kind of interesting because when you start overlaying those, you start to see a progression of things that have changed, houses that were there that aren't anymore, and vice versa. So sometimes when you're stuck where you really can't figure out how old a house was, those can at least narrow down the time frame for you. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or suggestions on other things that you'd like me to show you, by all means, put those comments in YouTube here, and I'll be more than happy to try to answer and maybe do other similar videos. And I hope this was helpful.